Okay, well, you'll continue to let people in if they come a bit later, correct?
I will keep an eye on that.
All right, wonderful. Well, let's get started. And I'd like to welcome everybody to our professional development workshop on integrating induction and abduction for theory development in big data research. And I'd like to say greetings to all of our colleagues and good morning for those of us who are in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Good afternoon, good evening, good middle of the night for some of you who are in the middle of the night. It's really great that we have an opportunity to get together. Something is speaking to me. I don't know what it is. So today's workshop is, we're trying to pack a lot in the next 90 minutes, and we have some formal presentations, but we also want to invite all of our participants to give their ideas, to ask their questions, to ask for advice as part of the roundtables, and then during the report back. So I'm Liz Davidson. I will be the moderator. I have a few introductory comments, very brief. Then we have a group of collaborators who've been doing this difficult but interesting stuff. We have Prasanna Kaharde, Abhishek Kathuria, and Ben Koninsky, who will be talking about their work using machine learning and abduction. Then we'll switch over to Brian Pentland, who will be talking about some of his work with collaborators using narrative networks to analyze trace data. Then we'll break out into our roundtables. I'll get back to those right before we jump into them. The idea is to start, depending on the number of people, we'll probably have 3 and start each one at a little bit different area, but be very open in our discussion. We'll have a brief report back, and then we'll conclude with Andrew Burton-Jones. We'll talk about some of his ideas about how we actually write up and publish work that explicitly or implicitly uses abduction. So that is the plan for the next 90 minutes. And to move us right along, I'm going to jump into what seems like an obvious question of what is abduction. And I do Zoom teaching all the time, but my mouse has a mind of its own. One of the things I've learned getting ready for this PDW is that abduction is really a pretty hot topic. There's a number of articles being written by top scholars, senior people in the field, who are both describing and prescribing ways of doing abduction. And the motivation is that there's a lot of challenging, unexpected phenomenon happening in our world today. Some of them due to the increased use of technologies in so many aspects of our lives, from measuring our heartbeats and our movements all the way up to, looking at changes in national phenomenon and culture. So there's part of it is that big data has brought in, I'm sorry, big data, it's an old hackneyed term, but we have so much data now about so much of the world that we didn't have before, and trying to make sense of it and in new and innovative and creative ways is challenging. And I think that's part of the motivation for thinking about new ways to be more creative in our theory development. There are also advances in analytic technologies that make it more possible, especially to deal with these very large volumes of data. The other thing that I thought was interesting is that a lot of the new developments that we're both excited about and a little worried about, or maybe a lot worried about, that have to do with artificial intelligence and machine learning, as those get developed and implemented into our business processes and our interactions in so many different ways, really rely on abductive processes. So one of the things that we can do to learn more about AI is to learn how AI is thinking and see if we can, as humans, keep up in that race. But it is hard to articulate in precise, legitimated methodological terms what abduction really is. So warning, we're not going to do that. We're not going to give you the final answer here, but we're going to try to give you some insights. So a little bit more tangibly, what is abduction? It's what we all do often in order to make sense of the world. We observe some things, we theorize, we come up with explanations. Why is that? What do we think led to that outcome that we just observed, or that experience that we just had? We experience it when we interact with others. For example, if we go to the doctor is going to look at our symptoms, look at how we present, and then they're going to make some abductive thoughts and assumptions about what might be causing our symptoms or what might have led to our health condition. Later, they're of course going to try to verify that, but that abductive jump that they make is going to lead them to come up with some conclusions about what to do next. So abduction is also very pragmatic. What is the practical implications? What use can we make of these theories? And it's also a bit difficult to describe and to really define. So I resisted defining is because it really depends on what text you read. The word abduction is often associated with Charles Peirce, who introduced many of these ideas in his philosophy of science. But he used many different terms. He called abduction deduction, hypothesizing, retroduction, and all kinds of different things. But basically, if we wanted to come at a very high level, stereotypical definitions, we said deduction is more about moving from general theories and laws and applying those to circumstances to make firm predictions about what is happening. Whereas induction is looking at many, many different instances and trying to generalize on a more probabilistic basis what the underlying rule or law or theory is that explains it. Abduction is generally closer to induction in that it's looking at specific outcomes, but it's trying to come up with particular explanations. Abduction per se is less motivated by coming up with general theory than particular explanations. And the goal is for them to be plausible and probable is not probabilistic, but this is a good way of thinking about it. And hence it's related to theorization. Of course, these three interact, and how they interact, I was trying to depict in my little picture here that it's not linear, it's interactive. Abduction can come in at different points. So often we think about abduction as generating new insights and creativity. If we're prepared, we still need a base of knowledge. We still need to know possible useful theories, possible explanations that we bring to bear. And what we're trying to do is generate some possible explanations and then justify the explanations we choose to pursue. So a term that you might keep in mind is this phrase, inference to the best explanation. Not the right, not the only, but the best. Right now, this is probably the best explanation for what we're observing. However, the criteria for what is best, of course, are not always clear. And then just to kind of conclude my remarks, as I said, a lot of scholars are beginning to write about abduction and try to help us to find ways to explain methodologically what it is that we're doing, how it fits in with more familiar and acceptable ways of doing research. This picture is from a forthcoming article by Seistra and Van de Ven in Academy and Management Review. And for all of you who are at this conference, you are now members of AOM, and you can get this article yourself from the AOM libraries. I would recommend it. It's very, very interesting, well-rounded discussion about the social side of doing research when abduction is part of the process, as well as how it fits into the bigger picture of doing research. And basically, I would say they focus on this idea of coming up with new, creative, innovative ideas, and then vetting those to find the most likely, the most reasonable explanations that could then be moved forward into other research methods. So that's all I wanted to say, to just kind of get in our minds a little bit of some common vocabulary for abduction. It's not the final or the perfect explanation. And now I'm going to turn it over to our first group. And Prasanna, I think you're going to be driving the shared screen. So I'm going to stop share and let you bring up your slides.
All right. Thanks, Prasanna. Hello, everyone. My name is Abhishek Kathuria. I'm from the Indian School of Business. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our learnings from integrating abduction and induction. This is work with Prasanna Karhade from the University of Hawaii at Manoa and Ben Kaczynski at Emory University. Prasanna, next slide, please. So we've been doing this for a while. This is almost this is more than a 10-year journey for some of us in our co-author group. And there've been several papers that we've published where we've tried to integrate induction and abduction, and several others that are in progress. What we're going to try to do is just work you through the very first paper, the most evocative and most delicious paper of them all, which is this paper about food, as the image clearly suggests. Next slide, Prasanna. So we started this research by actually trying to study the Mumbai Dabbawalas who deliver home-cooked food and trying to understand how their journey changed with the introduction of modern food delivery platforms. However, as we went through the process of doing this research, while that paper is still something that we're still crafting, we came up with a different paper where we tried, because as we talked to these gentlemen, we realized that not every restaurant participates on these food delivery platforms. And that kind of was this unexplained phenomenon that we came upon for which we couldn't find clear answers to. And so just to give you a context, what we're trying to study, what we studied in this paper was that we tried to understand why suppliers choose to participate on digital platforms like food delivery platforms that facilitate repeated low-value novel transactions. Now, I know there's a lot of, there's a lot of econ literature that talks about this from a two-sided market perspective, but there were things in this context that weren't really adding up. What we did was we had data from a food delivery platform where restaurants can choose to participate. They don't necessarily have to participate, which means around about a third. And we found that around about a third of the 95,000 odd restaurants on the platform were not participating in food delivery through the platform. These restaurants serve 135 cuisines and are located across the 37 largest cities of India. The critical thing to note about this data set is that it's a rich data set, not just in terms of the number of rows, but also in terms of number of variables. We had more than 50 variables that described the restaurants in our data set, right? And so we started to study this from a process of induction and abduction. So the very first thing we did is we as researchers, you can see that little human icon over there under my heading called formulating hunches. We as researchers looked at this list of 50 odd potential inputs to the induction process. And as Van de Ven says in their article, we formulated a few hunches. Based on our understanding of prior theory and based on our understanding of the context, we selected 14 of these 50 plus attributes to serve as inputs to the decision tree induction process for describing platform participation decisions by these restaurants. Now you can see these selections were based on key theories, which we listed down on the table next to it. And it was a systematic view that we took, which was an inside out view, starting from the restaurant going outwards towards the environment. We use these 14 inputs, the variables, as inputs to the decision tree induction process, right? Decision tree induction is a supervised machine learning algorithm. And what this does is it learns from a training sample and validates findings on a testing sample. And what we were asking the algorithm to tell us is, of these 14 attributes, what unique combinations of attributes allow us to predict which restaurant will participate versus which restaurant will not participate in food delivery on this platform. This process involved a series of computational experiments that led us to grow multiple trees. Next slide, Prasanna. And at that stage, we again as researchers, entered the equation and chose the best representative tree based on this trifecta of heuristics, wherein we wanted the trees to be highly predictive, have high parsimony, and yet the results should be reliable and repetitive across the trees that we selected. This is akin to, so we were trying to use the decision tree induction algorithm like a telescope to view what's up there. Next slide. And so again, coming back to the machine, what this whole process did is it gave us this beautiful holistic view in the form of a decision tree of the decision journey taken by these individual restaurants as they decided to participate or not participate in these restaurants, right? Prasanna, you want to talk a little about the trees, or should I carry on?
I could take over.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. So what you see here is the output of the induction process. As Abhishek mentioned, we started with a set of 50 features, and now, as you can see, the algorithm has weeded out most of the uninformative attributes. And what you see here is just a small collection of the most informative attributes. What I like really about trees is this whole part and whole way of organizing this decision criteria. And so you can think of the hermeneutic spiral, where you can look at a part, try to make sense of the part, see how it fits into the whole, and then that informs or shapes your understanding of the whole, which can then help you again iterate and make sense of the parts of the tree. So we extract these parts of the tree, which are the rules, and then we are able to identify rules for explaining why restaurants would participate on the platform, and rules for why restaurants choose not to participate on the platform. And so you can then focus your gaze on one rule and start the abduction process by beginning to form some generalized rules from these context-specific rules that you see. And how do you go about doing that? I think one way to do that is just to squint, in the sense you're squinting at the tree to not look at the specifics, but to really understand the theoretical structure or the theoretical backbone of that rule, which kind of moves you a little away from the realm of the data, and you're beginning to move closer to the theory and starting your abduction process. And we continue on that journey, and then we are able to distill our insights in the form of some of these propositions. So we have showcased one here. So after looking at all these different rules for participation and non-participation, we were able to abduct that the combinations of factors that explain participation are very different from the factors that explain non-participation. And so our experience doing this so there have been a few key lessons. I really like the natural fit between induction and abduction and multi-level theorizing, which really helps us truly explain a phenomena across multiple levels. This is a great method for not only identifying the strong patterns in the data, but to also shine the light on some weak signals that would really help us improve our understanding of the phenomena. In some sense, we have to let these combinations emerge. And so to me, one way of thinking about abduction is to not only let the data speak, but also listen. And so one way to think about abduction is maybe mindful listening, where you're letting you're trying to listen to what the data are trying to tell you. So as we try to step back and characterize this process and how we went about doing this, this kind of an illustration helped us, where we were diving between the zone of theory and the zone of the empirics. And so any of the scuba divers out there in the audience will know that setting up the dive is really critical and effortful. It takes a lot of effort. And so the same happens here, where prior theory helps shape and identify a phenomena that is not explained in the data. Some hunches have to be formulated. And so a lot of this upfront setup has to happen before one can take that deep dive into the data. And once you're doing that, you really want to stay there and kind of take that deep dive and make sense of what you see, and only surface when you have some insights. And so that is a good metaphor for this process that we were using, where we were interweaving between the realms of theory and empirics. A slightly different way to convey the same message is this burger. Abhishek insists on the whole food theme, and so we stick with that. And so upfront, what needs to happen is this mindful setup where this high level of abduction has happened, and it is after that has happened where you relinquish control, and in some sense the machine takes over and starts weeding out uninformative predictors to give you the tree. So theory is already shaping up, and it could take the shape of a tree. You have induced some hypotheses, and then you have to again make sense of what you find. And so you complete the knowledge production cycle by making sense of the patterns that you observe in the data. This method we find is very good at surfacing the unknowns. It also unburdens the researcher, because then you relinquish control to the method, and then it kind of lets the emergence happen. And so we find this is very good for refining our understanding of prior theory and to build new theory. So we try to depict the knowledge production process here, depict the yin and yang of the process by showcasing the need for human intuition upfront, which helps with breathing context and country into the data to begin with, which will then reflect in the insights and the theory. And so there is this constant reapportionment that needs to happen across human and system cognitors. So to leave you with some things that have worked for us. With big data comes infobesity, and one needs to manage infobesity in the theory development process as well. We need to allow the emergent combinations to surface, and then probe these unique combinations. This is definitely a balancing act, which requires human and machine cognitors to kind of balance their responsibilities, where you relinquish control to the machine, and sometimes you reset the computational experiment as and when needed. And so if we do this well, if we are able to inject context and country into the data, we will be able to produce good theory. We will be able to produce theory that is decolonized for this global community that we are a part of. With that, I will now invite Ben to share his thoughts.
Thank you. First, I want to congratulate Prasanna. As of tomorrow, he will be an associate professor. So today is his last day as assistant professor. So we congratulate them. I think one of the things that's important to me is that you're creating a conversation with the data, that is an interactive, and we respect the data not as a passive form, but as an active contributor to the conversation activity. As Prasanna says, the weak signals that sometimes are better informants are illuminated that in that process that allow us to better incorporate in the analogical reasoning that we're often leveraging in these analysis as well, in bringing analogs and letting the data speak via the shapes, the morphology that Prasanna was talking about as well. It is multi-ocular, so we're taking several lenses, and its respective, that conversation involves the several an empirical technique, a theoretical techniques that is multi-ocular, that brings multiple lenses to that conversation as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank all three of you for a really interesting discussion. I know that the audience undoubtedly has some questions, but I'm going to ask you to reserve those questions for in the breakout, where you'll have a chance to talk with each of these authors. There'll be one in each breakout room, and if there are specific aspects of what they talked about that you'd like to have them elaborate on, that might be a good opportunity to do so. Okay, Brian, are you ready to jump on?
Sure.
Okay.
If someone can focus me, or if anyone wants to, can just pin me as the person talking. I'm not going to share my slides.
We see you.
Okay.
You're walking
Okay,
around behind, you're walking around, and we see your slide in the background.
There we go. That's the view we're looking for. Spotlight. So that's a fabulous example it just makes me hungry just looking at all the beautiful food. So I'm delighted to think about that. So, in contrast, I had to look this up. I had to, Google what is abduction. I didn't know. So why are we giving us PDW about kidnapping? It freaked me out at first, but then I got it sorted out. And so it turned out that I had a good example of this to talk about in some work that we've been doing recently. And I think of this as, spinning straw into gold. You've got some big pile of data, right? Infobesity is a great concept, and you want to get some good result out of that, right? And so the example I want to talk about is electronic medical records from the University of Rochester Medical Center. So this is one piece of a bigger project. I should mention this work it's an NSF thing with my co-authors, Julie Reinwolf, my sister Alice, actually, and Ken Frank and our College of Education. So we got, about 7.5 million of these, right? It's a big pile of straws. 2 years of data from 4 dermatology clinics. My sister is the chair of dermatology department, which is good advice if you want to find a way to get data, is ask your family. And so we worked this into a paper that's just come out as a research note in MISQ on how to theorize about process data. So that's what I want to talk about. So you got all this detailed data, and to give you a feel for what we mean, here's a little animation that Julie put together. You've been in clinics like this, right? It's very simple. As a waiting room, a couple of exam rooms, a place to do procedures, right? And they've got a few people that work there, just a handful. They've got workstations all around, and a typical patient visit runs like, it's like this crazy combination of stuff that happens, right? So that's the phenomena we're talking about. And what we do is we use that big pile of straw, the detailed event log from the electronic medical records to summarize those patterns of action. And this is, we do that using this idea that I call narrative networks. It's a weighted directed graph, where the nodes, instead of the nodes representing people like they would in a typical social network, the nodes are action, stuff like, the nurse entered the vital signs, or the doctor prescribes medication. Because somebody does something, right? So it's action-based. And the edges in the graph, right, the nodes are actions, and the edges represent sequential relations between those, right? And what this does is it abstracts away from all the specifics of each patient visit, but it gives you a picture of the overall pattern of patient visits. And the way that we did this is we said, okay, in a typical dermatology clinic, they've got 25, 30 visits in a day, and then they stop overnight, and then the next day. and the way that they assign staff and physicians, each day is kind of a nice unit of analysis. Or as my sister says, some days everything runs real smooth, and some days it all just goes to hell. So we take one day as a unit of analysis, and we look at how the patterns compare over time, right? So we take, the idea is that each day in the clinic gets represented as a network, and we want to look at, this process, right? So that's the basic thing we're doing, and sort of my tagline these days. We're trying to think of, routine dynamics as network dynamics. This mouse out of there, that's weird looking. Anyway, okay, so and so we started looking, and we said, hey, whoa, what is going on here? Okay, I was just playing around with, running at R and saying, let's just look at each day over time. And voila, an opportunity for abductive reasoning. So it's what this is, right? So I sent an email to Julie and Alice, and I explained to them, this picture shows, 498 days, just consecutively, there's no weekends in there. And the y-axis is a measure of how similar they are compared to some standard. And this is just time, and then on a certain day, boom, it changes, it stays pretty similar, and then it changes back, and it changes again, and it changes. So what's going on here? Any thoughts? Julie writes back, Julie works at the University of Rochester. This is interesting, I'll have to look into this further. So, right, so that's where we got started. And so, so this is Julie, this is Alice. Alice, my sister, said, that must be when those new interns come in, because they screw everything up. You've all heard that. It's like, don't get sick when the new interns arrive. And so it must be a human resource thing. Something happens, new people, screws everything up, because she runs the clinics, and it's a big pain in the butt for her when interns come in. All right, but so my question, so we did some more analysis, right, to figure out, well, what's going on here. So this is the main thing that's in our research note, is different ways of using these directed graphs to look at change over time. This idea of a diachronic analysis of trace data. And the thing you'll notice is, in the previous picture, this is one clinic, but when we did it, we discovered that in all 4 clinics, this happens on exactly the same day each time. And there's another, I won't get into the details of this, but like on that specific day, there is an absolute transition. And so this looks like it's pretty noisy, but it's really actually not. So get these spike, definite things going on. So my question to you all, what's going on here? Any abductive explanations? What do you think it is? You guys are all bright researchers. You've all been to clinics. Summer holidays, I see. Okay, that's a good possibility. Anything else?
Ram Penton, how are you?
Hey, I'm good, thanks.
Ram Tenkasi.
Hey, Ram.
Long time, sir.
Yeah, long time. What do you think? What could it be?
I'm thinking you're doing too much data, right? You lost the interpretive sort of perspective on things.
Yeah, oh, for sure, totally. That's going to be my punchline. But I'm just asking you a specific question. What's happening on these days?
Nah, I can understand data patterns. I understand data patterns completely, but they tell you one story. Yes.
But they tell you no story at all, my friend. What's your hypothesis? I'm inviting you to do some abductive reasoning.
No, I understand that
based on your knowledge of the world. Do you have any?
Well, too limited data to me to do any abductive reasoning here, because abductive itself is a strange phenomenon. Never know how it works.
Oh, okay. Let's see, what else do we have? I'm just curious, other things. So Ram has had no idea. Andrew says it's hard to tell. What else have we got? I'm just very curious. An update, system update. Oh, okay, internet loss. Update to electronic head. So a couple people are suggesting that this change could be because of a system upgrade. for some kind of change to the technology. Well, Julie ran around for, I'm going to say, weeks trying to figure this out. So Ram, you're exactly right. And I'm giving you a hard time, but you're exactly right. There's not enough information here to tell what's going on. But let me finish my talk, and then I'll give you a chance to say, right. So the point of this is that this one here, this first change, turns out to be a change in the hospital, the medical system's policy on access to psychiatric records.
Right.
Nobody's going to guess that, right? And it changed, and it permanent change. This change here is the beginning of flu season, normal flu season, just like regular. So on these days here, when you come into the clinic, it's like, oh yeah, I've got a rash, fine. These days you come into the clinic and they ask you, oh, have you been vaccinated for flu, right? And that's flu season. That's the end of flu season. Here it is, and that's the begin, because remember, this is 2 years of data, right? So it's a very long, it's an extended period of time. Right, so the key message out of this, and I think Ram's exactly right about this, is that, first of all, trace data, you can see stuff that even insiders cannot see. Right, so we asked them, Julie went to ask the nursing staff and the clinic managers, what's going on here? And they were, like you guys, thinking, oh, I don't know, probably it's some mistake with the data, some data error. This can't be happening. As far as we know, everything's been smooth that whole time. Nothing's changed. No, and when she asks the IT people, was there a system upgrade? No. Was there, what was it? So the trace data allowed us to see stuff, right? And to me, that ability to see, to say it's not just in one clinic, it's in all 4 clinics, right? And it's not just one day, not just 1 year, it happened again the next year. That practically defines the mathematical sense of the term induction. When you do a proof by induction, you say it happens once, again. That's how induction works, right? Mathematically. So the ability to see stuff is something that's where the induction comes in. However, to interpret it, to make sense of it, you've got to have some kind of other information. You need to have participants or observers or insiders or somebody who can provide you what Liz was calling that best explanation, right? Because it's not the interns, it's not summer holidays.
And I think it's really cool. The gut explanation is probably the best explanation of abduction, personally.
Great, because what I think of this as is simply theorizing the data.
Yeah.
Right. Narrating the data. Say what is it in this picture that I'm actually seeing? And you heard me just then do it, so I won't do it again. Right. So so back to the main idea, we've got some thing you've observed here. And my particular issue of being able to look at a process that changes over time, using these sort of network models, that's the idea of this research note. And I've just sort of shown you that. So induction, you'll sort of see the change. Abduction, you explain the change. But the gold comes in when you can speak to, how does the world work? What is it about, and our case is just so prosaic, it's so simple that it doesn't, I'm not sure it even merits, flu season, like what the hell, right? So, but a deeper analysis or a broader kind of story could speak to bigger questions. How does the world work? How do processes change? Is it imbrication, patterning, endogenous change, phase changes, right? And then why do processes change? The motors of change, which you could look at. So that this idea of, taking the infobesity and running it through something to speak to theory is what I would think of as the sort of narrating the data, right? Spinning straw into gold. So anyhow, that's all I got. Thanks.
Nice job, sir.
That's my hedgehog.
Yeah, cool. Fine. Yeah. All good.
Thank you, Brian. Really interesting. I've done a lot of study of EHRs, and whenever I go into a medical setting, I always think, what's going on here, and try to peek at their screens. So I'm sure that if you were looking at data recently, you would be quite seeing even a lot more things going on with this terrible COVID epidemic and what that's happening. So thanks very much to our speakers who've done such a great job of staying on time and giving us some initial ideas. Now, we've been doing all the work so far. Now it's time for you guys to do the work. And we invite you to stay on with to the breakout session and to bring your questions about the topics, to bring your ideas about the topics, and if you want to ask for a bit of advice, not only from the people doing the presenting today, but from each other, please do. So we have 43 people, including ourselves right now. So I think we can go with the 3 breakout rooms. These are, again, just the initial starting ideas of Brian and I are going to focus more on, try to get some discussion going on integrating, deduction, induction, abduction. Abhishek and Ben will talk more about this role of humans and machines in the cognition. And Andrew and Prasanna will talk about some of these implications for identifying possible new insights or biases in data to come up with better, more general theory. So I'm going to open the breakout rooms. You can self-select in, including our panelists. We'll have about 15 minutes. And then we'll come back and share as a group, and then we will move on to Andrew's talk. So I'm opening the rooms now, and please self-select in. Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. We had a very lively discussion. It seems like maybe some of the other rooms ended a bit sooner, but hopefully that you have found the answer quickly. So what I'd like to do, because we want to make sure we have plenty of time for Andrew's talk and maybe a few questions and answers, is just go through room 1, 2, and 3, and just whoever was going to say something, just tell us in a minute or two what some of the key points were. Unfortunately, part of being virtual is you can't follow up with people in over coffee or over the social hour that but I think that all of us would be open to email, to other kinds of ways of catching up, maybe at one of the social hours. We'll see how that goes. So let's start, since I was already in room 1, I'm going to start with room 3 and ask somebody from room 3 to just tell us 1 or 2 points that you discussed.
We had a very brief discussion, but it was more on the lines of the question that what really is abduction, and trying to just explain that it's about sense making, and it's an iterative process that needs to happen multiple times. It's not linear. It's not like you do abduction, you do induction, you abduction. It's something that happens iteratively, and you've got to go back and forth between the human and the machine. And even during the induction process, the human beings have to intervene, or the researcher has to intervene multiple times to guide the induction, the machine learning based induction process.
Okay, thank you. How about somebody from room 2?
That was room 2.
Oh, room 3 then. That was room with Prasanna and Andrew.
Yeah, so we were talking about.
Go ahead,
Prasanna.
We were talking about different contexts and how the data itself might look very different. And so data collected in the European context would be maybe very lean given the privacy concerns as compared to some different contexts. And so then that would necessarily mean that the theory would also look very different. And so how should we as scholars accommodate these different theories? And yeah, so we were talking about these issues, and so really looking forward to what Andrew has to say about that.
Okay, and we had a volunteer for group 1 to kind of summarize quickly. Mark?
So I was the volunteer because I raised my hand first to ask a question. And we had very rich discussion. I'm not going to be able to mention everyone's remarks, but Natalia had some strong insights on the fact that the difference between abduction and induction was which lexicon was driving the research. So was it the social scientists lexicon, or was it the social object of studies lexicon? And that gave different approach of knowledge building. There was a distinction between conceptualization and inference that was brought up by Stefan, if memory serves. The one question that was asked, but unfortunately we didn't have time to really debate it, is can we start from theory and then induce? Or do we have to start from the data and then build theory? One observation was that greater data availability increased the intensity of inductive of induction. There was more induction when there was more data. Then there was a debate on the size of the metadata being perhaps more relevant than the size of the data itself to understand the complexity of the algorithms needed to draw contributions to research. And finally, I had a side thought on non-Aristotelian logic and what that meant in terms of opportunities to discover things through a non-Western thinker's mindset when looking at the data or directly at phenomena.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Very good
Yeah.
notes.
Was that okay, Liz?
That was excellent.
Can I stay?
You may stay. You get. We give.
Okay. I would just like to point out about what Room 3 shared, that the EU has actually developed guidelines for private data, nominative data for research purposes that enable not only researchers to still do work in social science, but also to keep the data longer for archival purposes for historians to have access to it later. So the situation is in the EU is not as stark as some people across the pond may realize.
We just like unfettered capitalism controlling our data. Thank you all for participating in the breakouts with your ideas. I know there's lots of other rich ideas out there, and I really, regret that we're not able to hang around outside the room for very long. 10 minutes after our hour, they're going to kick us out offline as well. So I'm going to jump into Andrew's talk, because one of the things, Andrew, that we talked about before you temporarily joined was, is this something really new, or is it something that all researchers do, and especially people who take grounded theory? And is this just really a new way of characterizing what we were doing? There's been a lot of legitimization in high level, high impact papers about abduction. So as for those of you who may not know Andrew, he's the editor-in-chief of MIS Quarterly, which is our top journal in the IS field, and also very broadly respected and read across the management disciplines. So Andrew, what can we give it to you and hear some of your thoughts on all this?
Sure, no problem. Happy to. So do you see my my PowerPoint slides? I don't think you do actually. Let me see.
Yes, if you, we were seeing them, but if you wanted to put them in presentation mode, you could have clicked there, but yeah. Back to you. There you go, perfect.
All right, so thank you for the introduction. Yeah, so the basic themes were listed here, and what I'll do is I'll give a little bit of introduction to my own views and to some of this work in MIS Quarterly, and then I'll talk a little bit about changes at MISQ that will facilitate more of this kind of work. And then I'll talk about guidelines for editors and reviewers, and then guidelines for authors. And as I'm doing this, I'll work in my thoughts on Liz's question. So just sometimes it's helpful just to know sort of where editors are coming from and their own views on this. And so I thought for those of you who maybe don't know me or don't know some of our board members or the journal that well, this is certainly would be my own view, which I would say is a sort of philosophical modesty. So basically all philosophical and logical approaches have limitations. There's no one best lens. So that the first philosophy of science book I used when I was a student was Chalmers' What is this thing called science? And essentially it's, the flavor was like pretty much every approach has limitations, and science is evolving and learning, and we're all in the same muddle together. The second one was really Kaplan's Conduct of Science, and really it was around, you know, researchers may read philosophy, they may use it sometimes, but it's really the philosophy and logic in action that matters, and that then performs philosophy into being. So the way in which we, for instance, the way in which we may say, oh, I am a positivist or I am interpretive is very different to what they meant when they were in the 1950s or 1960s, right? So the way in which we talk about abduction, the way in which we talk about induction, it can exist in philosophy journals, but what matters also is how we're doing it and the way in which we appropriate that term and perform it into being. The next was around, research is all around trade-offs. So sort of my initial training was all in sort of Cook and Campbell land, for those of you who did that in all of your doctoral programs and so on. And the idea was that it's really the least bad inference. You know, some definitions of abduction talk about, you know, inferencing to the best explanation. But if you read all those original books, it was all around that there's no best, like that it's really the least bad of all of the different alternatives. And you need programmatic work over time to, you know, triangulate and understand what we're investigating. So the point of all of this is that induction and abduction are definitely not new, that we can't even say they're necessarily better than anything else or better than what might be developed in the future. But what we could say is that we might be able to use them more effectively to make better trade-offs because the environment around us is changing. So if we have new data, new computational possibilities, then we might be able to make better trade-offs. We might be able to use better combinations and be creative. Moreover, given that science is constantly evolving and developing, and we're part of that, we perform it into being, we might be able to instantiate advances into practices that can be taught through the way in which we write them up and then teach them in doctoral classes and so on, and then further improved through papers. So this is really an opportunity for us. And that's, I think, why we're seeing these papers emerging and coming into top journals. It's a good thing, it's a good sign. But it's definitely not that abduction and induction are new. And it's really an opportunity for each of our fields and each of ourselves to say, can we push science forward given the new reality that we're in? So with that as a basis, I thought I'd give some examples of thinking at MISQ over the years. So I think combined use of induction, abduction, I think has always been the norm. And the acceptance of it sort of institutionally or in terms of legitimacy really came with the rise of grounded theory building. So there may have been an earlier paper, but I often think of Olakovsky's 93 paper as kind of the start of a lot of that work. And it's you know, a major theme across, you know, many of our papers now. It's just completely celebrated and normal. However, it is, the word abduction is typically not explicated. So I did find there was a Lars Mathiasen et al. Paper where they mentioned this, that most people don't actually use the word abduction. And there's even quite creative and sophisticated demonstrations of it. And so Shayla Miranda's paper and colleagues, which I'll mention later, is, I think, a really lovely example, but they don't use the word abduction. It's recently been used more explicitly. So the word abduction is it's being referred to more explicitly in papers. And I'll talk a little bit about this initiative on research transparency that we're going to be engaged in that I think is very consistent with it. In terms of momentum, where this is going, I'd really point you to these two papers that have just come out. They're short provocations. The Tremblay et al. One, which is called Theory in Flux, and then Natalia's paper, and Natalia was here, All IS Theory is Grounded Theory. I'd really recommend you have a look at both of those papers just to sort of see where the momentum of the conversation in our field is going, and the kind of, I guess, ways in which we might think about theorizing going forward in MIS Quarterly. Also, I was involved in a special issue on what we call next generation theorizing in MIS Quarterly that just came out in March. And we were trying to think about, like, what is theory? Where is theory going? How should we think about theorizing? And in these 4 statements here, from X to Y, we really sort of saw the left-hand side of each sentence as kind of maybe a traditional way of theorizing. So we might think of theory as the product of our work. It's really just a cognitive product. We might think of it as, approximating truth. It's kind of desk work. I can sit in my office and just write out a theory, and it's purely representational. So this box and arrow diagrams represents the world in some way. But really, we would like to move it or think about it more on the right-hand side. So theory is an intellectual conversation over time. It's just a lens. We also theorize as we reflectively engage in the world. Prasanna talked about how he would theorize when he was sitting in a restaurant looking at people as they're working. And, we can actually engage in the world, maybe even through design and action, and theorize as we're doing it. And then the theories may be performative, the theories of our stakeholders, the theories of our own, and so on, and understanding how they shape the world and could then shape us ongoing. Prasanna mentioned the hermeneutic circle before, which is a good analogy as well. So I think as we engage in inductive abductive reasoning, if we take more on the sort of right-hand side of these, of each of these statements, we can have more creative and engaged approaches to using these abductive lenses. Now, I mentioned that at MISQ we're engaged in some changes as well. So one of them is around research transparency. And when you look in the literature on abduction, some of that literature does talk a lot about kind of being more open about the way in which we actually do our research, and how that could help us in terms of I guess the truth of what we're doing, and also generate future work. So it can be generative as well as more accurate. So what we're essentially trying to do is to say to people that you don't need to send us long papers with 50 pages of appendices and all of the different sort of defenses of your work. Rather, focus your paper on the contribution, and then there's transparency materials that you can provide that can open up about the process and the resources you use for theorizing. And by separating the two, it could give us space to learn how to improve and innovate the content and style of each one. So essentially, I think for those of you with MISQ, but also with other journals, you may have noticed this gradual expansion of papers over time as people feel justified or they feel forced to put more and more and more into a paper. And essentially what I would call the scope of practice of a journal has become very unclear. What we'd like to do is to separate the two. So we say papers have, a fixed page limit. We can't put more and more and more into this. We can't force authors to do more and more, but we can allow authors the space to put additional material, and that can help improve generativity of this work going forward. So I'd encourage you to look at the editorial for how we'll do that, and maybe be part of that, help us innovate how we can think about this. All right, the next one was guidelines for editors as well as guidelines for authors. And what I have recommended is the same sort of headings here for each one. So in terms of substance and style, I would recommend that editors and reviewers focus on the advancements in substance and style while respecting variety in both. So for example, do you have to use the terms induction and abduction? There's excellent papers that I think have used induction and abduction without using those terms, and I think that's okay. Do they have to use them in certain ways? That Prasanna sent us a really helpful reading list on induction and abduction, and there were various different qualifiers, various definitions of induction that varied according to which citation you use. And I would not, as an editor or reviewer, force authors to use whichever one I thought was my favorite one or best one, because there's just too many different ones. But as I'll mention in the author one, it's just important that you're consistent with whichever one you use. In terms of standards and creativity, what I'd be looking for is some application of standards if there are norms for how to do this sort of work. So there was a question of Prasanna, did he use one type of rules or other, fuzzy sets and things. So if there's certain standards in an area that you're aware of them. But what I'd really love editors and reviewers to do is to move beyond just accepting an imperfect but important paper to actually champion one. So let's say that you have a paper, it's using some inductive abductive reasoning. It doesn't seem perfect to you, and rather than reject it because of the imperfection, or just say, okay, there's this problem here, as long as you acknowledge it, it's okay. If you actually see that this what could be a problem as an opportunity to publish a paper, to say, hey, there's something challenging here. I actually don't know how I would have addressed this either. If we get this out there, more people can build on this, and that will help a stream of research. So actually to champion it, we don't have enough people who are sort of brave enough to champion an imperfect but important paper. So if you can do that, then you'll be a great editor or reviewer. The last thing is what I'd call sheer uncertainty. So this is where good researchers pushes us into the unknown, and that should make us all uncertain. So actually having uncertainty about what these rules are, let's say if you're looking for rules in Prasanna's work, or if you're looking for other logical insights that you can get from data and you're not sure, that's actually a good sign. Like it's a sign that you're pushing into the unknown. And I think one really potentially dangerous thing that editors can do and reviewers can do is to put their own certainty onto that uncertainty, because that would then delimit the way in which people can then use that research going forward. So all participants in that process, the reviewers, editors, should be circumspect in how they're putting their views forward. So just as an example of my own process with this, I was an editor for Shayla Miranda's paper, really wonderful paper. The citation is below. And it was using this, it was essentially a quantitative grounded theory paper. And there was a lot of advances in terms of substance, in like the diffusion of innovations literature, organizing vision literature, and so on. There was also a lot of advances in style, like Shayla and her colleagues were really innovating in the style of write-up in the paper. But as a result of the advances in both substance, it was really complex. And so editorially, the effort was really around what's the simple story, and that became the focus of the editorial process. In terms of standards and creativity, Shayla and her colleagues were using lots of different standards for lots of different types of analysis. And there was just so many different standards, it was hard to pick, hard to justify. Also, typically most of the tests and most of the analyses didn't work perfectly, in the sense that there would always be judgment calls. And you can imagine there's a ripple effect of all the different judgment calls. So I remember at one point in my editorial work thinking, well, I really don't know about the results, and that I can't tell because there's so many possible ripple effects here. And it became then leading into this last thing around sheer uncertainty. So it's just unclear, what's best to do, what's needed, what's not needed. And Shayla included lots and lots of appendices to sort of help justify many of these different things. And I know in the very last period before accepting the paper, there was this long exchange between us around, do you really need this appendix? Can we take this out? Can we keep taking stuff out? But on the other hand, now with the Transparency Initiative, maybe we could actually leave some of those in, but it's just in another resource for people who are interested in taking this work further. So I took it out thinking that I was doing a good thing for the paper, but in fact, for the research going forward, perhaps it would be good if I had found a way to keep some of these things in. So that's my own uncertainty. Then lastly, for authors, in terms of substance and style, just be clear what you did, what style you're adopting, and don't feel pressured to over-justify things. With standards and creativity, the standards just keep evolving in this area. So what I wouldn't like to have is that someone, an author just leaps on one of the recent papers, the recent papers on abduction and just uses it as a checklist. I don't think that would be a great way of writing the paper, but you wouldn't want to willfully ignore all of these standards either. And then in terms of uncertainty, share your uncertainties. So that's probably my biggest request is don't hide your uncertainties or be concerned about them. Rather, that's what will increase your citations and offer future students their dissertation topics. And if you've got a good editor or reviewer, they'll champion your paper because of it. All right, so that was my thoughts.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. That's very, very interesting. General advice, but specifically when we're thinking about how to bring terminology around abduction versus induction and to describe these big data methods, some of which are going to be quite new to editors and reviewers. Some, maybe are going to be very, that the editor, the reviewer might be very fixed on a certain. I remember as a reviewer championing a paper that I really liked a lot, and one of the reviewers said, "You didn't use the method exactly right." And it was such a fascinating, interesting paper, but we did manage to get it past that and to get it published. So I think we have just a few minutes if we have questions for Andrew specifically, since he just talked, or general questions that or comments that people would like to make. He said, we're officially done in just a minute, but they won't close the room on us for just a few minutes after that. So if anyone has questions, comments, suggestions at all.
Andrew, I have a question. How are you socializing this among well-established senior editors, especially who, like from quant side, or such as economists?
I think we've been really fortunate in our editors that they are, I think, on board with this idea. To be honest, Natalia, one problem is that it's a bit like herding cats. We're very fixed in our views, and good researchers are often even more fixed in their views. Some of the sort of deep-seated views that we've always had for years. One thing I like, and maybe it's the purpose of these kind of workshops, is until you talk with people, you don't realize that they may have different views than are expressed in their papers. Like your paper on all IS theory is grounded theory. Unless you had talked with these people and knew them, maybe you wouldn't have known those stories, right? So one thing that we're doing as an editorial board at MISQ is we're doing, we're calling them masterclasses, maybe it's the wrong word, but essentially knowledge sharing amongst editors around different approaches. And I guess through those sessions, we're learning more about how we actually think. And some of these sessions we're saying, oh, actually, you don't think that differently to me. I just didn't realize that, you use different words or different examples and so on. So through more knowledge sharing, more discussion amongst the board, I think we'll become better and kind of more, we won't jump to conclusions because of just the papers that we've read of each other's and so on.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks.
I think an ongoing challenge, and when I was thinking, Andrew, you were saying, well, what am I going to say and what I'm going to talk about a week or so ago, I was thinking, well, what would I say as an editor? And also as somebody who's worked with a lot of doctoral students. And I find that I'm thinking that the structures of genre and how you write work up are very constraining. That in the past, I've both been an observer and probably a perpetrator of kind of trying to help authors fit what they did into a very recognizable genre. Like in qualitative work, it's always, do you put the model up front or at the back? And then you get, if you're the author, you get questioned, well, did you derive the model from the data or did you start with the model? And when I think about that in terms of abduction and words like hunches and insights and creativity, those are topics that, like you say, represent an uncertainty. But I just wonder how open editors and reviewers are going to be to words like that versus saying this is not quite what I've seen in the past, so therefore it seems wrong. And I know some of you are dropping off, that you need to go on to other sessions or other things in life. That's fine. We'll probably end the session in just a couple seconds. I don't know, Andrew, did you have any further comments, or anyone else?
Well, I guess one thing I'd say to authors is to always be willing to push us and to be creative. Like if I totally agree with you, Liz, it's one role we might take is to help authors put something in a recognizable form. But if we have authors who make that decision before we get the paper, we'll lose a lot of creativity and novelty, right? So sometimes it's great for us to have an author who doesn't feel beholden to the norms and push us, and we'll say, wow, that's a paper we want to publish. So I guess I would just love for the authors who are listening to think, okay, the journals want something different and they'll send us some. So please do be able to say.
Ben, would you like to make any last comments before you go off and have your Mai Tai? You look like you're in a tropical resort. I know you're not, but.
No, I think it's important that people challenge the vocabulary, and that means the intellectual vocabulary, not just the word base, looking at the shapes, how shapes start thinking. The 21st century is critical, because too much of what we're doing is trying to fix the 20th century, and we have an opportunity to be bolder in our thinking. And I want to speak to that model 30, 40 years from now, or try to have a voice that will resonate there, rather than just trying to improve on yesterday or today's.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of our presenters for coming into this topic, and Prasanna for kicking us off and getting this going, and to the OCIS division for initially accepting and promoting that, and all of you who attended. Thank you for your comments, and I hope that we can keep up some dialogue, at least in some ways, even if not over a real coffee hour or a social hour. And that light, our AOM producers saying you can leave comments on the session in the AOM board. And I think, David, we're ready to close down, and I wish you all a good morning, afternoon, evening, or back to time to go to bed and have some sleep.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye all. Thank you. Liz,
Thank you.
thank
Bye-bye.
you very much. Bye, all of you.
Cheerio.
Thank you.
Tekien, sayonara.
Toodles.
Arrivederci.
Toodles.
Toodaloo.